you very much. Okay, I'm going to, yes, as was said, talk about some of the experiences from the Clim-ATIC project. But I'm also going to touch on a few other things as well. The Clim-ATIC project, well, it's just come to an end. It's a 3-year programme funded by ERDF, the Northern Periphery Programme. And it's a project which included 5 different countries, 13 different partners, and lots of different people. In all, we worked with 10 different communities. There's about 2 communities per country to look at all the different aspects of adaptation to climate change and try and learn lessons from them. We started right at the beginning with these communities, looking at vulnerability assessments, communicating the kind of impacts that they could see, the projections, looking with them to try and see what those impacts will be, both direct and indirect, trying to work with them for developing adaptation strategies and implementing real adaptations on the ground. So throughout all of this, communication was a key aspect. And we wanted to use different, novel and innovative ways of communicating so we could learn as well through the project to see what worked and what didn't. So this talk, keeping it quite brief, but it's some of those methods that we used and some of them that I particularly liked and think worked well. Like I said, I'm also going to mention briefly a couple of other things. And we were going to get Futera to come and do this talk, but I was a lot cheaper, so I've been doing it as well. But they did send a load of their books, and these are 2 particular documents that I found very useful indeed. So I would recommend you get hold of this, Sell the Sizzle. We've got a big bunch of them in a box on the table, but I think it's a really useful document. It's perhaps aimed a little bit more at communicating climate change to the general public, but I think a lot of the good examples and recommendations can be taken in terms of communicating research. The other document there that you see up, I don't have a copy of, but you can see the link and you can certainly find it on Google, but I think a really useful document helping you understand how to communicate, and particularly some of the kind of mindsets and the psychology about communication. And I did take a lot of the lessons from that into the Clim-ATIC project. And before I go on to talk about Clim-ATIC, there was just a few points that, particularly from that book, I think it's worth raising very briefly. Mental modes. Now that's something really, the kind of mode that we have, the mental picture that we already have in our mind about a subject, could be any subject, is quite hard to break. And this is something that particularly is mentioned in this book, and that if we're trying to communicate any subject, but particularly climate change, we already have an opinion formed in our mind, very often based on past experiences, maybe incomplete facts and perceptions, but we do need to somehow think how we're going to transform that mental node when we're wanting to communicate effectively. A good example is that climate change gets very much confused with weather. And I think, these kind of simple explanations need to be got over at an early stage in that communication. Framing a message. Well, there's a lot talked about, and certainly Futera doing it in Sizzle, Sell, like the climate change message, about how we frame that message. All the different techniques we use, whether it's visual aids, photographs, whether it's looking at past experiences, real life experiences, local experiences, whether we're using charts and graphs, whether we're using stories, real examples, the jargon that we use, the scientific terms, all these different things will help or not help in some ways to try and sell that message and frame that message. So it's very much worth thinking about that. I think it's quite interesting that the document also says we have 2 different brain processing systems. We have what's called an experimental processing system and an analytical processing system. The first very much reacts to emotional type situations and facts. So it could be that stories, experiences, these kind of less tangible type of things are very good at communicating, but they actually perhaps don't last a particularly long time in our minds. Whereas when we do go for the facts and figures and the graphs, yes, they may not have the instant impact, but perhaps that will have the more long-term impact. We are, as a human species, being very much evolved to not look too far in the future. It's only in very recent years that we've been able to look into the future and looking at our projections for UK SIP 09 is one way that we're trying to look at our future. But if you think back 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, as the human species has developed, we've very much been on that fight and flight type of system. We just react to our environments. So we're really trying to do something now in terms of adaptation to climate change. Is something that we're not evolved to be doing. We don't look into the future as a species. So it's again a big communication challenge to see how we can possibly do this. And another point that's mentioned in this document is something that we have is a finite pool of worry, which is say, so we can only worry about one thing at one time, and if we're worried about climate change and then something else comes along, such as an economic crisis or we're going to lose our job, out goes the climate change and in comes the next one. So a difficult challenge, I think, to keep people's attention, particularly for climate change. And that goes just as much for policymakers and decision makers as for the general public. Single bias action, single action bias is again another very interesting aspect of the way we respond to communication, particularly for climate change. A really obvious example is that when you're going into a community and you're talking about mitigation, for instance, they think, let's replace all the light bulbs in our house, yep, we've done our job, that's it, we don't need to worry about anything else. You might talk to a farmer about adaptation. He can look at species changing in a lot of detail, but actually he'll ignore all the other aspects that he can look at on his farm in terms of adaptation, whether it's different irrigation systems or shelter belts or whatever it might be. So we have to get across that you need to be much more holistic in your approach to implementing some of the aspects of climate change. We talked a lot about uncertainty today. I don't think there's any clear solutions to that. It is an issue we all have to deal with. The precautionary principle, though, is I think one of the key points that should always be mentioned when we're talking about uncertainty, and I think that is certainly one of the ways that we're trying to make sure that we're dealing with it. Tragedy of the commons is again something that I come across a lot when I'm doing workshops with different groups. If you have a group of individuals, then they can all basically work in that room together, but all self-interested. They will just think of themselves, and they could, in effect, deplete all the resources or whatever you're thinking about. But if you start looking at group affiliation and you bring people together to have a common purpose, a sense of common good, then you can start to get results. Some good examples of this is I had a workshop with the general community in Glen-Urquhart as part of the Clim-ATIC project. We had all sorts of people, farmers, B&B owners, school children, all sorts of people, and we did a workshop trying to identify the impacts on them that will be in drumlin rockets, climate change in the future, looking at projections. And we just got a wide range of uncoordinated responses, and in effect the workshop wasn't particularly successful. But I did the same workshop with just the farmers in Glen-Urquhart, and I did the same workshop with just the tourism business sector in Aviemore, significantly improved in terms of the outputs because they all had that common sense of purpose. They all then started to discuss the impacts on them and how they could then work together. And I think that's something that we are as a society have a danger of turning into the tragedy of the commons, unfortunately. Okay, so that's enough of those points. Let's get on to some of the more fun stuff. So we talked about some of the workshops. Yeah, I probably talked about 10 workshops across Scotland as part of Clim-ATIC, but all the other countries as well did a vast number of workshops. Lots of different methods. We were using films, we were using maps, we were using photographs, all sorts of different ways. We worked with Highland Council, used the Clip system as well, where we started to identify extreme weather events. These kind of things really helped, real life experiences, working with maps and landowners to identify flood risk and land issues that could be impacted by climate change. Certainly, I think